For instance, mentioned it in a series of lectures in forensic medicine that he gave at the University of Göttingen in the summer term of 1751. And I quote him, "In the 40s of the present century, it was rumoured that a true Centaur could be seen in London. However, this legend was never verified." Von Haller was not inclined to believe in what he took to be a mere rumour. Still speaking to his students, he made it quite clear why they also did not believe in it and in like stories. Quote, "We do not have one single example of such a birth that we knew of with an absolute historical certainty. For that ancient authors claim that there was a light centaur in Egypt during the lifetime of the Emperor Tiberius, and that some more recent ones also give notice of human, was perfectly human, despite the fact that he or she had been given birth to by a human donkey, can by far not be considered sufficient proof." The phrase ancient writers or Schriftsteller des Altertums in German alludes here to the Roman natural historian Pliny, who does in fact mention an Egyptian centaur. The knowledge of antiquity then that had come down to von Haller in written form apparently no longer sufficed for von Haller or for his colleagues to prove that a thing or animal exists or once existed. First-hand observation of contemporary enlightened naturalists was needed, or at least very much desired. That von Haller should be critical of a rumour of this sort is not particularly surprising to a modern reader. Almost like no other person, he seems to embody the virtues of the enlightened 18th century naturalist. We know that he was an ardent and diligent observer, and that he firmly believed that physiological knowledge should be based primarily on anatomical knowledge and physiological experiments. So how then could the Swiss physiologist possibly not be opposed to the very idea that creatures like centaurs existed? So far so good. But can the expulsion of creatures such as the centaur from the realm of the true over the course of the early modern period really be attributed to a victory of empiricism over erudition, of observation over book learning? If I believe that this was the case, I could stop speaking right now. And I might add, my dissertation would have been submitted after a few months' work. My dissertation inquires into what arguably lies at the very heart of our understanding of the so-called scientific revolution, of late fairly contentious concepts. The relationship between reading and observation in the study of nature from the second half of the 16th through the mid-18th century. It concentrated largely on sources that derived from engagement of early modern naturalists with what they called monster. A then particularly flourishing topic in natural history and medicine, and one wherein the triumph of the scientific revolution and its alleged empiricism appears to be especially obvious. I argue that we might want to avoid the simple narrative of the victory of empiricism over book learning and distinguish instead different forms of empiricism and different forms of scholarly reading that we find among early modern naturalists. For not only the practices that we consider empirical, such as observation or experiment, changed over the course of the long 17th century, scholarly reading practices too underwent significant and consequential transformations. Early modern naturalists in fact never stopped or tried to stop reading, even though their rhetoric sometimes suggests the opposite. Just think of the phrase "Nullum verba." Let me briefly then run you through the argument of my dissertation. What we've just heard was a very concise version of my introduction. We are now moving on to the first chapter, which approaches the relationship between reading and observation around 1600 empirically. It operates at the level of published natural historical and medical texts, and it shows on hand from 3 examples of monstrous factoids, little building blocks that come up in different texts, that in the late Renaissance case history statements of more general or theoretical nature, and also the visualizations of monsters circulated widely. What is more, such bits of knowledge frequently transcended the boundaries of both textual and discourse. Monstrous factoids easily made their way from historiographical or photographical writings, for instance, into natural history, and sometimes back again, as was the case with this image of a rather unusual two-legged centaur. Now, with chapter 2, we leave the surface level of published discourse in order to take a close look at the machinery underneath it, if you will. The practices that brought these texts about. The focus lies on the practices of reading and writing of a particularly important player in the discourse on monsters in the late Renaissance, the eminent Italian naturalist Giovanni, whom we see here. Giovanni's vast exemplarplus is used to reconstruct how Giovanni read, how he dealt with visualizations, and how these practices bore on the way in which he wrote about monsters. The similarities then observed in chapter 1, the preceding chapter, between the circulation of visual and textual bits of knowledge can here be grounded in the everyday scholarly practices of a Renaissance scholar. Giovanni dealt with images and text in a strikingly similar fashion. To give you one example, he used a cut and paste technique, for instance, for all drawings, prints, and the notes he took from his reading, as you can see here. With the next chapter, we return to the level of published texts in order to complete our analysis of the discourse on monsters circa 1600. Once enough knowledge about a given phenomenon was collected, by Giovanni for instance, a naturalist had to decide in what order to publish, to present it. The problem of devising the right order for knowledge appeared to learned authors in the Renaissance to be more pressing than ever. As some historians have forcefully argued, they were facing an information overload. But was their role vis-à-vis the so-called information overload purely reactive? True, the discovery of a new world through the invention of printing certainly did contribute to the swift increase in available knowledge. But so, of course, did the scholars themselves. That is, the same group of people whose complaints about the abundance of books were at the time proverbial. Of course, they didn't stop publishing their new books. The chapter tackles these issues by way of a comparison of the information architecture of two fairly successful, but upon first sight, very different books on monsters of the period that were published in the early 17th century. Johann Georg Schenk von Grafenberg Proben Historia, that you see to the left, a printed reference book, first published in 1609, that has so far been all but neglected by historians of science and medicine alike, and fortunately Chetty's much more famous treatise, Demonstrabum Natura, etc., first published in 1616. What you see here is the more influential 1634 volume or edition. Despite their different social and geographical backgrounds, and despite the different ends to which their books were written, the ways in which Schenk and Chetty brought order to the vast materials available on monsters was strikingly similar. I guess we all agree that scientific academies were crucial for the developments that we have to come to call the scientific revolution. Chapter 4 discusses the role that monsters played in the context of such institutions in the second half of the 17th century. I focused especially on the publications of the members and correspondence of the often neglected Academia Naturae Curiosorum, today the German National Academy of the Sciences Leopoldina. This academy is an especially interesting and salient example. For less than 20 years after it was established in 1652, its program was considerably revised in highly significant ways. Shifts in the definition of scientific authorship that had taken place but gradually elsewhere in Europe were here codified within a very short period of time, which enables us to study them as it were under a microscope or magnifying glass. Initially, the members of the Academy were meant to write encyclopedic monographs on some element of materia medica. In other words, they were asked to collect, mostly through reading, factoids on the objects in question, say wine, and weave them into an encyclopedia. In 1670, however, the Academy established its own journal, the Miscellanea Curiosa. With this journal came a new focus on things that occur rarely in nature, hitherto unknown disease, for instance, or monster children, animal, and plants of the kind that you see here. With this journal also came a new form of observing and writing, for which the members of the Academy now quickly had to acquire the necessary skills. The epistemic genre, to quote Gianna Pomata, chosen for the articles in this journal was the observatio. Writing observatio implied that the author singled out a nugget of his own experience and documented it in a written form. The author of an observatio was thus no longer a collector of knowledge from various sources, but an author whose discourse emanated from his own experience. But even the observatio genre still offered a place for knowledge acquired through reading. That is the scholium, a separate rubric that typically followed directly after the observatio and the printed texts, and that was meant to collect similar cases in the earlier literature. So we're dealing here still with a learned empiricism, to borrow Nancy Rice's in Gianna Pomata's happy term. However, the author of an observator was asked to keep his own observation neatly separate from those he found in the writings of others, which I think is highly significant. Finally, my dissertation returns once more to the rumour about the Centaur in London. Here you see another image. Notwithstanding their recurrent rhetoric of experience, enlightened authors such as Albrecht von Haller, for instance, did not generally read less or spend more time observing than did their late Renaissance predecessors. In fact, their reading practices may in the meantime have undergone even more dramatic changes than had their practices of observation. Observation had become an integral part of their reading practices, as it were. That is, they frequently repeated observations that they knew from the literature. What is more, we could hardly hope to be able to prove that centaurs, basilisks, or some other seemingly bookish creature does not exist by means of observation alone, or to observe something that is not there. Hence the importance of enlightened reading practices. Those intellectuals who engaged in the discussion of seemingly fabulous creatures and events had learned to deal with the literature differently from their Renaissance predecessors. In particular, they had developed new ways of assessing the probability of accounts of the supernatural phenomena and events. By way of a conclusion then, let me propose a very short and condensed summary of what I've just presented. In my view, you can fruitfully distinguish between three overlapping forms of describing and visualizing the monsters that are tied in with the changing practices of scholarly reading and scientific observation. And here you see them, the factoid, the observatio, and the repeated observation. The ways in which reading and observation were related to one another differs from one stage to the next. Of course, this is highly idealized. I think it might be helpful thinking about it in this way. Perhaps I have begun then to convince you that A, reading and observation were never fully separate, that B, scholarly reading never lost its crucial place in scientific practice, and that C, the changes that occurred in the reading department were perhaps no less significant and consequential for the contours and contents of the category of the monstrous at least, than were those that took place in the observation department. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I'm going to let you field your own questions. Other questions to address on Margot's topic as CEO Leslie? I'm going to give it to Kathleen.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I look forward to reading more of your work. One thing that strikes me is that the period you have been studying is also the period when reported information begin to flow into towards European scholars from all around the world. And I wonder whether, because the Centaurus is not exotic, it's mythological,